And he's also from Lisbon, and then in the same university. And his presentation, do you need to? No,
If I'm not going to speak, maybe.
And his presentation today is entitled Cosmology and Jesuit Translations During Japan's Christian Century. So,
Well, before beginning, I would like to thank Professors Ken Nejime and Hiro Hirai for inviting me to this conference, and also to Ryuji Hiraoka for indicating my name. I would also like to thank Professor Kuni Sakamoto for coming with me in the plane, and Yoshi Kato for picking me up in the plane and bringing me to my residence. Until quite recently, in Japan, science has been, to a large extent, translation. The effort to try to understand the universe has been centered in the importation, interpretation, and gloss of foreign texts. Moreover, to the evolution of scientific ideas in Japan, we can find a close correspondence in the evolution of translation activity, in the change of the source of imported texts, and in the modification of translation methods. Ideally, translation would produce a version of a text in a different language that would be, without much ambiguity, similar to the original. However, this does not always happen due to several reasons. One is that vocabularies are different. Sometimes they are so different that one language lacks words for some concepts that need to be translated. Even when this is not a problem, it also happens that there is no bionivocal correspondence of meaning between words in different languages. Another reason is that different grammatical structures sometimes do not allow for the expression of similar patterns of thought. The more dissimilar are the languages involved, the less we can expect the translation to be similar to the original, and the more aggression of spurious meanings and loss of the original ideas are bound to occur. All these problems were present in the translation of cosmological manuals into Japanese. Finally, we might add that different translation approaches to solve the above-mentioned problems are bound to lead to different results. Therefore, it is somewhat surprising to notice that the history of Japanese science almost ignores the evolution of the translation praxis. It is as if this praxis were irrelevant to the transmission of scientific ideas and concepts that took place before the 20th century. Let me start by recalling that it is usual to distinguish two main periods in the history of transmission of Western cosmology to Japan before the Meiji Restoration. The first took place during the Christian century, the period that is topical to this conference. The cosmology transmitted was that of the Aristotelian tradition, and the transmission was made by Jesuits. These Jesuits, when not using Japanese, spoke and wrote mainly in Portuguese and Latin, and the books and texts they introduced into Japan were in these two languages. Naturally, the tradition of learning that they introduced came to be known as Namban Gakto, or Southern Bavarian School of Learning. The second period took place during the late 18th and early 19th centuries. The intellectual framework was post-Aristotelian and included such important developments as Copernican heliocentric theory and the Newtonian gravitation theory. It was made mainly through books written in Dutch and brought into Japan by the merchants of the Dutch East India Company. Naturally, this tradition came to be known as Rangaku or Dutch learnings. The translation methods used during these two periods were quite different. During the second period, most, not all, but most of the texts relating to cosmology and the physical sciences were translated by Nagasaki official interpreters. As a rule, they worked alone. They were basically linguists with little or no specialized knowledge of those sciences, besides what they could grasp from the books they were translating. Moreover, they were especially careful to avoid making mistakes, as they had been conditioned by their professional experience to expect heavy punishment for any error. Thus, they tended to follow, as much as possible, a verbum pro verbum style of translation, and thus to achieve a word-for-word faithfulness to the text. During the first period, texts were translated by Jesuits and their followers. They seldom worked alone, and as a rule, a linguist would work with someone with a specialist level knowledge of the matters at hand. Moreover, their view of books and what was proper edition and translation was somewhat peculiar. The objective of this talk is to draw attention to some of these peculiarities in the process of edition and translation used by the Jesuit missionaries during the 16th and 17th centuries. My argument is that the Jesuits viewed written texts in a completely different way to how we see them today, and more to the point, in a different way to how the Japanese translators of the Rangaku period saw them. The translations made by them and by their disciples were made according to principles that are foreign to our modern practice and were also different from those used by the Rangaksha. Thus, when no proper account is made for this, some misinterpretations are bound to occur. Here, I would like to stress three ideas that I intend to illustrate during the remaining of this talk. One is that Jesuits of the 16th and 17th century, as well as many other Europeans of both earlier and later ages, lacked the strong sense of ownership of a text by its author that we have now. A consequence of this is that we can find in this period what I will call intratextual fluidity of expression. By intratextual fluidity, I mean that same idea or the same set of ideas is expressed in different ways in the several printed editions of what is basically the same text. These different editions are published attributed to the same author, oftentimes without his knowledge. Another consequence is that we can also find the direct transfer, or shall we call it copy or plagiarism, of part of the text by one author, the other text by other authors. I shall call to this process intertextual transferability. Let me give you an extreme example to illustrate the above processes at work. Juan de Avila, born in 1499, was a Spanish priest that became famous by teaching Christian doctrine to children in Andalusia. As his work became known, young men would join him and help him in this task, and some became his disciples. Sometime before 1550, Juan de Avila wrote a declaration of the 10 Commandments with their globes. Most probably, this little book was no more than a summary of the central part of the doctrine he usually taught to children. It was published in Baeza in 1550, but unfortunately this edition is lost. 4 years later, in 1554, it was printed in Valencia what has been called the Doctrine by Juan de Avila. This is the oldest extant version. After this edition, there were many other editions of this doctrine. There was one in Messina in 1555, another in Medina del Campo in 1558, and another in Valencia in 1571. And there were many others. both before and after the death of Joan de Ávila in 1569. One point I would like to draw your attention to is that, as was recently established by the historian Luis Resines, all these editions, except for the very first one of 1550, were made without Joan de Ávila giving his permission or even knowing about them. Another interesting point is that the Valencia edition of 1554, as well as all later editions, cover much more material than the Ten Commandments. Therefore, some texts, we might say a large portion of text, not written by Joan de Ávila, was added to what was written by him and was published, attributed to him without he knowing it. By whom was added this text? Probably by some of his 30 or more disciples that later joined the company of Jesus. How could they do it? And how did they dare to do it without his consent? The answer is that they had heard Joan de Ávila teach many times, and they had taken notes of what he taught. Being his words, they thought it legitimate to expand the original text, therefore enriching it while being faithful to their master's intention. Moreover, they thought it would be useful to its readers. None of them thought that they were doing anything wrong by publishing the expanded text and ascribing it to their former teacher. Of course, if this was done today, the person who did it would face the law. Also interesting is that none of the above mentioned editions is exactly the same. There seems to be a deletion as well as addition of sentences, and there is also the rewriting of sentences with different words. This did happen perhaps because different disciples took notes at different times and went on to make different editions of Joan de Ávila's doctrine. Or perhaps just because someone thought it would read better. We can thus observe what I call intratextual fluidity of expression between several versions of the same text. Nonetheless, it should be stressed that in spite of all the differences in the expression, in the words and in the sentences, in spite of the changes, when it comes to content, to the ideas that are taught there, all editions are basically equivalent. I think that the example of the Fides Notio that was presented this morning by Professor Ori might fit into this intratextual fluidity of concept. Still more interesting is that we can find large chunks of the text of Joan de Ávila doctrine in many other doctrines and books. For example, considerable portions of all of these books, and here we find mainly doctrines, but other kinds of books. For example, number 2, La Cartilla, is a reading book for children. We can find in all of these books considerable portions of the doctrine of Joan de Ávila, without mentioning from where they come. And this is just a small sample. There are many other later books where we can find what seems to be a direct copy from Joan de Ávila's book. So, although we have no time to go through some textual examples here, this illustrates what I call intertextual transferability between books of different authors. Of special interest for us is the Doctrina Cristã of Marcus George, this last one, because a Japanese Doctrina Cristã was printed in 1591 that bears considerable resemblance to it, providing us with an example of intertextual transferability. If you allow me to make a small side remark, I would like to say that I found the the observations made this morning by Professor Igawa about the resemblances between the chronicles of Urbano Monte and the Relazione del Viaggio published by Colliano Bertoli, very interesting, and I think they fit in this concept of intratextual transferability. Well, this Japanese doctrine had 4 editions in a short 10-year time span during the 1590s. Again, none of all of these 4 editions are exactly the same, and thus we can also see the same phenomenon of intratextual fluidity of expression taking place in the late 16th century in Japan and in Japanese. My argument is that we can also find these processes at work in the transmission of cosmology to Japan during the Christian century. Will time allow it, I will argue that the policy of translating Western texts following these 2 processes of interfluidity and intra-transferability can be grasped from some of the public and private Jesuit documents of the period. I will cite Parlignano and other authors. I will also try to draw your attention to a certain parallelisms we can find in the exposition and in expression between In Sfera Ioannes de Sacro Bosco by Christoph Clavius and the Kenko Bensetsu and its variants, as well with the Sfera of Gomez and the Nigi Ryakusetsu of Kobayashi Kente. Moreover, I would like to argue that the intra-flexibility and inter-transferability framework can also be applied not only to texts, but also to illustrations and figures. So, as my time is coming fast to an end, and I just have 20 minutes, I will simply show you the 2 processes at work in the illustrations found in several books of Aristotelian cosmological tradition. Here we have an image of the relationship between the 4 basic elements of Aristotelian cosmology as it appears in Clavius' work. And here is how this relationship appears in the Kenko Bensetsu. In some way, as part of the text of Kenko Bensetsu is very similar to that of Clavius, so are some of the illustrations, and this is one of them. The basic difference in this one, besides the language, one was in Latin, this is in Japanese, is the lack of the Christogram in the Kenko Bensetsu. Here we don't have the Christogram, here we have it. But basically, it is the same image in a different language. So we have here an example of intra-transferability. Here we have the same figure, this time in the Temon Bio. This is the Temon Bio, considered to be a variant of the Kenko Bensetsu. We notice that the relationship between the elements and their qualities are written with shorter phrases. The language here is much shorter than in Kenko Bensetsu. Here the explanation is much more detailed. And there is also some other differences. One of the most interesting is that the character for Earth here is Tsuchi, no Do, and here is Chi. These are the main differences. But I think that we have here an example, if we think of these 2 books as variants, an example of intra-flexibility. The author was writing this one. The person who wrote the Temon Bio did not feel obliged to use exactly the same words as is found in the Kenko Bensetsu. The sphere of Gomez has not a similar figure, but the relationships are exposed in detail in the text. You can find it in the text. However, in the Nidi Ryakusetsu, which can be considered either a Japanese version of Gone's text with some intra-textual fluidity, or as a text by Kentei with a lot of inter-textual transfer, we can find this curious diagram that basically expresses the same relationship, but using a different way of drawing it. Not to burden you much more, just let me give you another example of another variant of the Kenko Mesetsu, the Shidai Zensho, where we have this figure. We can go just for one more example. Here we have in Sfera Johanne Sacrobosco an example of showing one of the arguments of why the Earth is round. So basically we have Earth at the center, the Moon and the Sun, and two people in different places of the Earth see the position or the shadow of the Earth on the Moon at different times. We have here what is basically the same diagram, but this time on the Kenko Mesetsu. Curiously, the Moon comes here, instead of being up, is down, and the Sun is above. And here we have the same figure in Temon Bio, much more information than, basically the same information, but more detailed than in Kenko Mesetsu. And finally, the same figure is one much poorer, that we can find in the Bensetsu Namba Unkisho. And so I would like to conclude by noting that while in the world of the Rangakusha, a book was a much more settled, definite text that made sense to translate verbum pro verbum, in the world of the Namba Gakuto, a book was a much more fluid thing, much more changeable, absorbing bits of other texts and being absorbed by still other texts. It was fitting in such a world that translations were made following the tradition of libertas utilities, making large changes to the original and adapting it to the tastes and needs of translator and intended readership. The great number of variants of the Kenko Mesetsu is, together with the Doctrina of Joan de Ávila, one of the best examples of this, although many others, as was shown today by other people, also exist. Thank you.
Thank you, Miguel. Very interesting.